A man with a shaking hand and 7 months of sobriety walks into a town he's never been to just to buy coffee and fix a horseshoe. But what he finds instead is something that makes his blood run cold. 7 women lined up on a courthouse porch being sold like cattle, and a judge sipping tea like it's a Sunday picnic. 6 women are taken. 1 remains, bound in rope, bruised, silent for 19 days straight. Not because she lost her voice, but because she decided no one in that town deserved to hear it. And when their eyes meet, he does something his brain never agreed to. He steps forward, says one word. Her. He doesn't know that this woman is the only living witness to a murder. He doesn't know a killer named Cain is already waiting. He doesn't know the judge just set a trap, and he walked right into it. What happens next will cost people their lives, their land, and everything they thought was safe. But the truth? The truth has a way of surviving, even when everyone holding it is broken. The lesson. Sometimes courage isn't the absence of shaking hands. It's pulling the trigger anyway. The meaning. This story is about broken people choosing to stand when staying down is easier. It's about the difference between power and truth, and how one voice that refuses to be silenced can tear down an empire built on fear. You don't have to be whole to do something that matters, you just have to show up. If this story made you feel something, a chill, a spark, anything, drop a comment and tell me which moment hit you the hardest. Hit like so this reaches someone who needs to hear it today. Share it with that one person who's fighting their own battle right now. And if you're new here, subscribe and turn on notifications because stories like this, they don't come around every day. Stay until the end. I promise, it's worth it. Elijah Cole had seen terrible things in his life. Bodies stacked like cordwood at Shiloh. The face of a child he might have killed, lit for half a second by muzzle flash before the dark swallowed everything and left only the sound. But he had never seen anything quite as ugly as 40 grown people standing in the July sun buying women like livestock and calling it charity. He had not come to Copper Bend for this. He had come for a set of reins and a pound of coffee and maybe a word with the blacksmith about Ridley's left front shoe, which had been throwing sparks on rock for the last 30 miles. That was all. A simple morning in a simple town, the kind of stop he had made 100 times in the 4 years since the war ended, and he had started drifting west with no destination and no particular reason to find one. 7 months sober. He counted the months the way some men count money, carefully, and with the constant fear that the number would shrink. Every town had a saloon. Every saloon had an open door. And the smell that came out of every open door reached for him like a hand grabbing at his collar, whispering that one drink was not a relapse, and that the shaking in his right hand would stop if he just held a glass again. He passed the Lucky Strike without stopping. His right hand trembled against Ridley's reins. He gripped tighter with his left. The crowd was what stopped him. It filled Main Street from the saddler's shop to the courthouse steps, blocking every path he might have taken to finish his errands and ride on. Ranchers, shopkeepers, miners still wearing the gray dust of the morning shift, women on porches, some pretending not to watch, children sitting on barrels. A man selling roasted corn worked the edge of the gathering like it was a 4th of July parade. And on the courthouse porch, in a wicker chair with a cup of hot tea steaming in the 100-degree heat, sat a man Elijah had never met, but recognized immediately. Not the face, the posture. The settled, unshakable calm of a man who believed he owned everything his eyes could see and was generous enough to let other people live on it. Judge Solomon Hatch spoke quietly. No oratory, no performance. Just the voice of a man explaining something reasonable to reasonable people. The territory needs families. These women need homes. I would call that a sensible arrangement. 7 women stood on the porch steps below him, scrubbed, dressed in clean cotton, hair pinned back. Some stared at their shoes. One, a redhead no older than 20, trembled so hard the woman beside her reached over and held her hand. They had been cleaned and presented the way a man presents horses at auction, and the comparison turned Elijah's stomach even before the bidding began. A rancher in a brown vest stepped up first, pointed to the redhead. A deputy led her down the steps, holding her elbow too tight. The rancher signed a piece of paper on a table by the railing. 11 seconds. That was how long it took to decide a woman's life. The second man picked a dark-haired woman who kept her chin up but could not stop her lip from shaking. The third picked the tallest one because he said loud enough for everyone to hear that he needed someone who could reach the top shelf. Laughter rolled through the crowd like it was the funniest thing anybody had heard all summer. Elijah watched with his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. He did not intervene. He had spent 4 years learning not to intervene in anything. Standing still was the only skill sobriety had given him so far. 6 women gone, then 7. The blonde wept silently. A young cattleman signed for her and led her away. 1 remained. She stood at the far end of the porch steps, separate from where the others had been. Her wrists were bound in front of her with cattleman's rope, the stiff kind with fibers rough enough to cut skin, and the skin beneath was raw and crusted dark. Her dress was gray, shapeless, torn at the hem. Her hair hung across her face like she had stopped caring who saw what was underneath. But her eyes. Elijah saw her eyes, and something in his chest shifted the way the ground shifts before a sinkhole opens. Those eyes were sweeping the crowd slow and steady, face by face, and they were not empty, they were not broken. They were counting, recording, memorizing every person who looked at her and looked away, not the eyes of a victim, the eyes of a witness. Hatch took a sip of his tea and gestured with the cup. Well, that leaves our last guest. He said it the way a man introduces a dead horse at a livestock show. Any takers? Silence. Someone coughed. A child whispered to his mother and was hushed. She does not cook, Hatch continued, his voice carrying with the practiced ease of a man who had made speeches his whole life. She does not clean. As far as I can tell, she does not even talk. She has been in custody 3 weeks and has not said one word that was not a curse or a threat. What did she do? A man called from the back. Hatch's eyes flickered. Just for a heartbeat, just enough for Elijah to catch it before his expression smoothed back into place. Let us just say she has a talent for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But that is behind her now. I heard she killed the marshal. Another voice. The marshal's death, Hatch said. And now his voice had an edge that cut the crowd quiet, was a tragedy. Investigated and closed. This woman was cleared of suspicion and released into territorial custody for her own protection. That is the official record, and I will remind you all that I keep the records in this county. The words settled over the crowd like a wool blanket in July. Heavy, suffocating. Nobody moved. Well, Hatch said, setting down his cup, if nobody wants her, I suppose she goes back to holding. Elijah did not decide to step forward. His body moved before his mind agreed, the same way it had moved at Shiloh when the shooting started, before thought had time to make him a coward or common sense had time to make him still. He stepped off the boardwalk and into the street, and the word came out of him low and steady, carrying the kind of weight that made people turn before they understood why. Her. Heads swiveled. Hatch looked down from the porch. Something crossed the judge's face that Elijah did not expect. Not anger, not resistance. Calculation. The man studied Elijah the way a rancher reads weather, measuring what was coming and how to use it. Then Hatch smiled. Not the crowd-pleasing smile. The other one. The one that said he had already figured out how this served him. Son, I do not think you heard me right. That one is not wife material. She is barely alive material. I heard you fine. She does not cook. She does not clean. Sounds like she has got sense. The laughter stopped. Hatch's eyes narrowed. You are serious. I am standing here, am I not? A long pause. Hatch set down his tea. He looked at Elijah the way a man looks at a knot he cannot untie, irritated but already reaching for the knife. What is your name? Elijah Cole. Cole. Hatch repeated it like he was filing it away. You are new to Copper Bend. Passing through, then pass through. Pick another town for your charity project. I am picking her. The judge stared at him. Somewhere behind Elijah, a horse stamped. A dog barked twice. The child asked again what was happening and was hushed again. Fine, Hatch said. She is yours. Deputy, cut her loose and get the paper. Elijah stepped onto the porch. He took the knife from the deputy's hand. Not fast, not aggressive. Just took it the way you take a tool from someone using it wrong. He turned to her. Up close, the damage was worse. The rope had dug grooves into her wrists deep enough that the skin had swollen around it. Dried blood cracked in the creases. The bruise on her cheekbone was green at the edges, days old. Her lip had been split and healed and split again, but her eyes were looking straight at him, and they were not grateful. They were measuring, testing, running calculations that had nothing to do with hope and everything to do with survival. He held up the knife so she could see it. I am going to cut the rope. That is all. She did not nod, did not blink, just held her wrists out, the tiniest motion, and waited. He cut the rope. It fell to the porch boards. The raw skin underneath pulsed red in the sudden air. She pulled her wrists to her chest, fingers curling and uncurling as blood flowed back into her hands. Her jaw tightened against something that might have been pain or might have been the effort of not crying in front of 40 strangers. She did not thank him. He did not expect her to. Hatch held out a piece of paper and a pencil. Sign here, Cole. Understand that once you walk off this porch, she is your responsibility. Whatever trouble she brings is yours. Elijah took the pencil. He could not read the paper, could not read any paper. He made an X where Hatch pointed and hoped the document said what the man claimed it did. Congratulations, Hatch said, and the word was a weapon. You just took on the most troublesome woman in Copper Bend. Elijah folded the paper and put it in his vest pocket. He turned to her. Can you walk? Her voice hit him like cold water, low, rough from disuse, but steady. Absolutely steady. The voice of someone who had been silent for 19 days, not because she had lost the ability to speak, but because she had decided that no one around her deserved to hear it. I have been walking since before you got here. Then let us go. He walked down the steps without looking back to see if she followed. She followed. Her bare feet hit the dirt and she flinched. The ground had been baking since dawn, and her soles were soft from weeks on stone floors. But she did not slow down. She walked beside him, not behind, and the crowd parted again. Wider this time. On the way out, a man leaned against the hitching rail to their left. Lean, 40 or so, a federal badge catching the sun. Deputy Marshal Oscar Finch watched them pass with eyes that gave nothing away for free. But the way he looked at Sarah was wrong. Not concern, not relief, something colder, something that looked a lot like calculation. Finch dropped his voice as they passed, low enough that only Elijah heard it. Watch the South Road tonight. Then they were past him and moving down Main Street. And Elijah filed the words away, because a man who has survived a war learns to file away anything that might save his life later. They reached Ridley, the brown Mustang tied at the post outside the saddler's. Elijah swung the saddle blanket straight and was checking the cinch when he heard it. Hatch's voice carrying from the porch. Quiet, not meant for the crowd, meant for the thick-necked deputy standing beside him. Do not kill her. Follow them. She will lead us to what she stole. The words reached Elijah across 40 yards of hot air, and he felt something shift inside his chest. The auction had not been what he thought. Hatch had not been trying to dispose of the woman. He had been setting her free the way a hunter sets a bird free when he wants to see where it flies. The trap was not behind them. It was ahead. And Elijah had just walked straight into it with a woman he did not know. A horse that needed shoes, and a shaking hand on a gun he was not sure he could aim. He mounted up, reached down for her. She took his hand, the first time their skin touched, and her fingers were ice cold despite the heat. She swung up behind him, and he felt her sit rigid against his back, every muscle drawn tight, and he made sure not to press closer than the saddle required. They rode east out of Copper Bend, and behind them on the courthouse porch, Judge Solomon Hatch picked up his tea, took a long, measured sip, and smiled the smile of a man who had just set a very particular trap and was already calculating the moment it would close. Sarah Dunn counted every step the horse took on the scorching ground. Not because she cared about distance. She had passed the threshold of caring about distance on day 12 of her captivity, somewhere between the second beating and the third. She counted because counting kept her from thinking about the man sitting in front of her on this horse, the man who had bought her with a mark on a paper and was probably waiting for her to say thank you. She would not say it. She had stopped saying thank you to men a long time ago, because in her experience, thank you was a door that men walked through and never came back out of. They heard gratitude and translated it into permission, and Sarah Dunn was done granting permissions she would spend the rest of her life regretting. She studied him from behind, because that was what she did with everyone now. She studied, she measured, she calculated. What she saw did not impress her. A dirty cowboy with a worn saddle and a horse that was strong but not fast. His right hand trembled on the reins. Not a lot, not enough that most people would notice. But Sarah noticed everything, because noticing was how she had survived 19 days in a stone cell with rope on her wrists and a judge who wanted her quiet or dead. He had no plan. That was obvious. He had left town with nothing but a set of reins he had just bought and the clothes on his back. No water, no food, no spare ammunition. He had not come to that auction intending to take anyone. He had acted on impulse, which meant he was either brave or stupid. And in Sarah's experience, the difference did not matter when bullets started flying. The memory came without warning. The sound of the gunshot. Not a crack, not a bang. Something flatter and heavier, like a book dropped on a stone floor. Then the sound a body makes when it hits wood. A sound she had not known bodies could make until she heard James Hadley fall face down on the courthouse floor, with a hole in his back and his blood spreading faster than she thought blood could move. And then the other memory, the one she kept locked in a room inside her head and would not let out. The 3 steps between her and the door, the shout she could have made. The frozen seconds when her body chose fear over action and a man died close enough for her to touch. She shut it down, counted the horse's steps, kept her spine straight. They were a mile past the last building when she spoke. "Stop the horse," the cowboy pulled up. The heat shimmered off the road ahead of them, turning the distant hills into a wavering mirage. Sarah twisted in the saddle. Her fingers worked at a seam near the hem of her dress, the only hiding place she had left, and she pulled out a piece of paper. Small, folded tight, creased so many times the paper was soft as cloth. "If something happens to me," she said, holding it out, "this needs to reach a man named Edward Walsh at the Tucson Star. Not the sheriff, not the marshal. Walsh. Nobody else." He took it, turned it over in his hands, did not open it. She noticed that. "What is it?" he asked. "Proof that Judge Hatch stole half the land in this territory through forged deeds and invented taxes." She told him that much. She did not tell him the rest. Did not tell him she had watched Hatch shoot a United States Marshal in that courthouse. Did not tell him she was the only living witness to a murder that the whole territory believed was committed by a drifter who had conveniently disappeared. She gave him enough to make him useful. Not enough for him to understand what he had walked into. Not enough for him to make his own decisions about whether to stay. She knew this was manipulation. She did not care. Caring was a luxury for people who were not being hunted. "Which way?" he asked. "South first. There is a creek bed that cuts through Miller's Canyon. I walked every inch of that ground with my father before I could read. The walls are high enough to hide a rider, and it bends west before it opens near the old Yuma Road. From there we can swing toward Tucson without touching the main trail. You know this land." My father worked the mines south of here for 6 years. This was my country before it was Hatch's. He turned the horse south without argument. She appreciated that. Most men would have questioned her. Most men would have insisted on their own route because taking direction from a woman with rope burns on her wrists was somehow beneath them. This one just turned the horse and rode. She held on to the back of the saddle. Not to him. She was not ready to hold on to anyone. They rode in silence for 20 minutes before she looked back. She did it casually, turning her head as if checking the terrain. But what she saw made her gut go cold. Dust trails. Behind them. Not two, which was what she expected. Hatch always sent men in pairs. Garrett and Polk. She knew their names because she had spent 5 months cleaning the courthouse and listening to everything the men inside it said, filing away every detail the way a squirrel buries acorns for winter. There were 3 trails, 2 riding together, moving fast. Those would be Garrett and Polk, but the third was separate, further back, moving at a different pace. Not chasing, following, observing. She did not know who the third rider was, but the fact that someone was watching both the hunters and the prey changed the calculations entirely. She said nothing to the cowboy. She had already given him more information than she gave most people. She would figure out the third rider on her own, the way she figured out everything on her own, because that was how Sarah Dunn had stayed alive this long, and she was not about to change the formula now. The sun beat down. The horse moved south. And behind them 3 columns of dust rose against the summer sky, like fingers pointing at something the whole territory was about to learn the hard way. The dry creek bed Sarah had promised was no longer dry. June floodwater had turned it into knee-deep red mud that smelled like rust and rot. And Ridley refused to go further by planting all 4 hooves and staring at Elijah with the particular expression only a horse can manage. A look that said, "You go first, and I will wait here and think about my choices." Elijah swung down and sank to his ankles immediately. The mud sucked at his boots with an obscene sound. He pulled 1 foot free with effort and took a step and pulled the other foot free and took another step and realized that walking through this mess would take hours they did not have. He looked up at Sarah. She was staring at the muddy passage with an expression he had not seen on her face before. Not fear. Something closer to fury. "This was dry in May," she said. Her voice was tight, flat. "It is not May." She did not respond. He could see her working through it behind those sharp eyes, recalculating, measuring the failure against every plan she had built in 19 days of staring at cell walls. She had mapped this route from memory, had staked their survival on ground she had not walked in 2 years. And the ground had changed. "We go around," Elijah said. "There is no around. The canyon walls are 40 feet high on both sides. The only way through is the creek bed. Then we go through the mud. With this horse carrying double, we will be stuck before we get 100 yards." She swung down from Ridley's back and landed in the mud, her bare feet disappearing up to the calves. She cursed, kicked at a rock, cursed again. Her hands were shaking, not the slow tremor that lived in Elijah's right hand, but the rapid vibration of someone whose body was running on rage because rage was easier than admitting a mistake. Elijah had been around enough people to know that the ones who cannot be wrong are the most dangerous ones to follow when they are wrong for real. He filed that away alongside everything else he was learning about Sarah Dunn. They spent 2 hours finding an alternate route. Up and over a section of canyon wall where the rock had crumbled enough to create a rough path. Ridley balked twice and had to be coaxed with a firm hand on her bridle, and patience Elijah did not feel but performed anyway because losing your temper with a horse is as useful as arguing with weather. They made it over the ridge, but the canyon had cost them. And it was about to cost them more. Ridley was limping. Elijah noticed it on the descent. A hitch in the Mustang's stride, favoring the left front. He stopped and ran his hand down the horse's foreleg and found it. A sharp stone, probably from the flooded creek bed, had cut into the soft part of the hoof just above the shoe. The cut was not deep, but it was swelling, hot to the touch, and Ridley flinched when he pressed it. "How bad?" Sarah asked. Bad enough. She can carry one rider at a walk. Maybe, but not two, not fast, not far. Sarah's jaw tightened. She said nothing, but Elijah could see the math running behind her eyes. Their only horse was getting slower at the exact moment they needed speed. The mistake in the canyon was not over. It was compounding, accumulating. The kind of error that does not announce itself with a single disaster, but bleeds you out drop by drop until you look down and realize you have nothing left. They climbed higher, keeping to the ridge where the scrub offered some concealment. From the top, Elijah could see the basin below. And in the basin, a single rider. Tom Garrett sat on his horse beside a stand of mesquite, looking around with the body language of a man who had lost something and was not entirely sure he wanted to find it. His rifle was slung on his back, not in his hands. His shoulders were rounded. "That is Garrett," Sarah said behind him. "He rides for Hatch. But his rifle is on his back. Which means what? Which means he does not want to use it." Elijah studied the man below. 30 years old, sunburned. The kind of rancher's build that comes from lifting and hauling, not fighting. The horse under him was a working animal, not a war horse. Everything about Tom Garrett said ordinary man in an extraordinary situation. They made their way down to the basin. Garrett spotted them at 100 yards and brought the rifle forward, but did not aim. He held it across his chest the way a man holds a fence rail when he is leaning on it, not the way a man holds a weapon when he means to fire. "Don't make me do this, Cole," Garrett called out when they were close enough to speak. "Hatch sent me and Polk. Polk is watching the East Fork like a fool because he thinks you took the main road." "I knew better." Sarah stepped forward. "Tom, listen to me. Judge Hatch stole your water rights. Page 47 of his ledger. A forged power of attorney that you never signed. Your cattle are dying because of him. Your land is worth half what it was because of him. And you are sitting here with a rifle pointed at the only two people trying to stop the man who did it to you." Garrett's face twisted. "You think I do not know?" His voice cracked on the words. "I have known since April. I have watched my cattle get thinner every week. I have watched the creek dry up. I have laid in bed at night while Annie sleeps and stared at the ceiling and thought about what I would do to that man if I could. But Annie is 7 months along. 7 months. If I cross Hatch, we have got nowhere to go and nothing to go with. He will burn my ranch. He will make sure nobody in the territory gives us work. My wife and my baby will starve. So you tell me, Miss Dunn, you tell me how your righteous cause feeds my family." Sarah opened her mouth to argue. Elijah stopped her with a hand on her arm. He stepped forward. "I am not going to tell you it is safe," Elijah said. "I am not going to promise I can protect you or your wife. I cannot even promise I can protect her." He nodded toward Sarah. "Then what good are you?" Garrett looked at Elijah's hand. The right one. The one that was trembling against the revolver grip. "Your hand is shaking, Cole. You are going to protect her with that?" The words landed like a fist. Elijah had no answer. Because there was no answer. His hand was shaking. It had been shaking for years. And the man holding the rifle had just said out loud the thing Elijah told himself every night before he did not sleep. He swallowed the humiliation. Let it burn all the way down. Then he said the only thing he had left. "When your kid is old enough to ask what you did when Hatch was running things, what are you going to say?" Garrett's jaw worked. His fingers moved on the rifle stock. The silence lasted 10 seconds. 20. Long enough for a hawk to scream twice overhead and for Ridley to stamp her bad hoof and flinch. "I will tell Hatch I lost your trail," Garrett said finally. "That buys you 4 hours. But if he asks me a second time, I will point the way. I am not dying for you. I am not dying for anybody except the woman in my house. 4 hours. Better than a bullet." Elijah nodded. Garrett turned his horse, then stopped, looked back. "There is something else you should know. Hatch hired someone from Yuma, came in on the noon stage yesterday. Tall man, scar along his jaw, wears 2 guns. I heard Curtis call him Kane." Beside Elijah, Sarah went rigid. Every muscle in her body locked at once, the way a deer locks when it hears the branch snap. The first time he had seen real fear on her face. Garrett rode away without another word. The sound of his horse faded. The basin went quiet. "Who is Kane?" Elijah asked. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "Virgil Kane is not a hired gun. Hired guns do a job and collect payment. Kane does a job and watches the funeral. He does not bring people back. He brings proof that people are not coming back." She turned to him, and the fear in her eyes was deep enough to drown in. "He is a hunter, and we are what he hunts. Elijah looked at Ridley. The Mustang stood with her weight off the bad hoof, head low, sides dark with sweat. Even without the cut, she would be struggling. With it, she was a liability. "How far to the woman you mentioned?" "Agnes Clay. 4 hours if we cut through the hills. Maybe 5 with the horse limping. Then we had better start." They moved north. Ridley limped along behind them, the cut in her hoof making her step short and careful. They walked beside her now, splitting the load. And with every step, Elijah felt their margin of safety getting thinner. 4 hours from Garrett, 5 hours to Agnes, a wounded horse. A killer named Kane waiting somewhere between here and wherever they were going. And a shaking hand that a stranger with a rifle had seen right through. He flexed his right hand. The tremor was there, always there. The souvenir he had brought home from the war, along with the memories and the drinking and the face of a child lit by muzzle flash. He looked at the revolver on his hip and wondered for the 100th time if the bullet would go where he aimed it, or if it would go somewhere else the way it might have gone somewhere else on that evening in Tennessee, when his unit fired into a farmstead at dusk, and a child did not wake up the next morning. He did not share this thought with Sarah. He had known her for 3 hours. That was not long enough to share the worst thing about yourself. But the question Garrett had asked sat in his chest like a stone. "Your hand is shaking. You are going to protect her with that?" He did not have an answer. He kept walking. The shotgun barrel was the first thing Sarah saw when the cabin door opened. The woman behind it was so small she nearly disappeared behind the stock. But the way Agnes Clay held that weapon told Sarah everything she needed to know. This woman had fired it before. And the only question in her mind right now was whether these two strangers were worth the cost of a shell. "You are on my land," Agnes said. Her voice was the voice of a woman who had been making herself understood in a world that preferred her silent, wiry. Gray-streaked hair pulled back tight, an apron dusted with flour still tied at her waist. "Yes, ma'am," Elijah said. He kept his hands visible. His right hand was shaking, but he did not try to hide it. Sarah noticed that. Most men tried to hide their weaknesses from a woman with a gun. This one did not bother. "Give me a reason not to pull this trigger." "Agnes." Sarah stepped into the lamplight, and Agnes's eyes moved to her, and the shotgun did not lower, but something in the woman's face changed. A crack in stone. "Sarah Dunn." Agnes said the name like she was reading an obituary. "I heard you were sold off this morning." "I was. To him." Agnes looked at Elijah. She measured him the way a woman measures a man when another woman's safety depends on her judgment. Slow, thorough, missing nothing. "You touch her?" "No, ma'am. You plan to?" "I plan to keep her alive. That is as far ahead as I have gotten. That is what they all say." "Agnes?" Sarah said again. And this time her voice carried something raw, something she had not let Elijah hear before. "Please, we need your help." The shotgun lowered 1 inch, then 2. Then Agnes stepped back from the doorway and jerked her head toward the inside. "Get in, both of you, before someone sees." The cabin was warm and close. The air smelled of bread and dried sage. A kettle hung over the fire and the table was set for 1, though it could seat 4. The kind of table that used to be full and was not anymore. Agnes leaned the shotgun against the wall but kept herself between it and them. She looked at Sarah. Really looked. Taking in the torn dress, the rope burns, the bruise, the bare feet blistered and bleeding from the hot ground. "Sit down before you fall down," Agnes said. Sarah sat. Agnes poured water and set it in front of her, then turned to Elijah. She asked him the question she needed to ask. Do you want justice or do you want revenge? Because I have seen enough women call one thing by the other's name. The question was aimed at Sarah, not Elijah. Sarah looked at her hands wrapped around the cup of water. She opened her mouth, closed it, could not answer. The silence said everything. Agnes sat down across from them. My husband Samuel died in that mine 3 years ago. Same mine. Same rotten timber supports. Same judge who cut $12 from every shaft and called it efficient management. My boy Danny still works down there because I cannot pull him out without Hatch noticing. Her voice was level, but her hands were not. They gripped the edge of the table with knuckles white as bone. I have known what Hatch is for 3 years, Agnes continued. I have watched him sit on that porch and drink his tea and hand down sentences and sign papers and smile at people whose lives he has ruined. And every Sunday I walk past that courthouse on my way to church, and I think about my Samuel's shotgun. And I think about what it would feel like to walk through that door and end it. She paused. But I do not. Because if I do, Danny has no mother. And a dead woman cannot raise a boy. So I keep my mouth shut and I pour coffee for Hatch's men when they board at my house, and I memorize their schedules and their routes and which nights they drink and which nights they patrol. And I wait. For what I was not sure until you walked through my door. She looked at Sarah. You said you need my help. What do you need? Sarah leaned forward. We need to get into the courthouse Saturday night. There is a ledger in Hatch's private chamber that contains every crime he has committed. Every forged deed, every stolen acre, every name. If we can get that ledger to the federal authorities in Tucson, Hatch is finished. Agnes shook her head slowly. The ledger is not behind the wall anymore. Hatch moved it 3 days after you were arrested. I saw Briggs carry it upstairs to the iron safe in his private chamber. Sarah went still. The color left her face. She looked like a woman who had been building a house for 19 days and just watched the foundation crack. 19 days of planning in a cell. Every calculation based on where the ledger was hidden. Every step of her plan, beginning with a wall panel she had opened a dozen times while cleaning. And it had been moved before she ever left that cell. Her plan was obsolete. Everything she had built her hope around was in a different room behind a different lock. Then we need a new plan, Elijah said. Sarah stared at the table. She was good at planning, good at thinking slowly and carefully, building each step on the one before it. She was not good at improvising, not good at changing direction when the ground moved under her feet, but Elijah was. He thought fast the way a soldier thinks fast, not brilliantly but practically, finding the next piece of cover when the one you are behind starts taking fire. Between the 3 of them, they built something. Sarah knew the courthouse layout, every room, every hallway, every door that stuck, and every floorboard that squeaked. Agnes knew the guard schedules, Curtis on the front door from 8 to midnight. A man named Briggs doing rounds every 30 minutes. Though he was lazy and usually sat behind the building smoking between passes. And Elijah knew tactics. How to move through a building at night. How to be quiet. How to get out fast when getting out slow meant getting dead. No single one of them had enough. Together, they had a chance. There was one more thing. Agnes went to a cedar chest in the corner and pulled out a pair of shoes. They were small, worn, but clean. The shoes of a girl who had outgrown them years ago. These were my daughters, Agnes said. She did not elaborate on where the daughter was now. Something in her voice said the girl was not in a place you could visit. She held the shoes out to Sarah. Barefoot on desert ground is not brave. It is stupid. Wear these. Sarah took the shoes. She turned them over in her hands. They were simple. Brown leather, laces frayed but intact. The kind of shoes a girl wears when she is learning to walk in the world and has not yet learned that the world does not always want her walking in it. She put them on. They fit. And for the first time in 19 days, Sarah Dunn cried. Not loud, not dramatic. Just tears running silent down her face while she stared at her feet in a dead girl's shoes and felt something she had not allowed herself to feel since the night James Hadley died on that courthouse floor. She felt like someone had looked at her and seen not a witness or a fugitive or a problem to be solved, but a person with bare feet who needed shoes. Agnes pretended not to see the tears. She turned to the stove and poured stew into bowls and set them on the table. "Eat," she said. "Both of you. We have work to do." Later, after Sarah had fallen asleep on the bench by the fire, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like cedar and old wool, Elijah sat across the table from Agnes, and the two of them talked in low voices. "Why are you here?" Agnes asked. "The real reason." Elijah looked at his hands. The right one trembled. He watched it for a moment the way you watch something you cannot stop and cannot explain, and have learned to accept the way you accept weather. 7 months ago, I was lying in an alley in Santa Fe with an empty whiskey bottle and a knife wound I did not remember getting. I woke up, and the sun was on my face, and I could not tell you what city I was in or what month it was. And I thought, this is how I die. In an alley, and nobody will know my name because I never did anything worth knowing it for. He paused. I do not know if this is better, but at least I'm standing up. Agnes studied him for a long time. Then she said something that stayed with him. My husband drank every night after the mine shift. I hated the smell on his breath, but at least he knew he was broken. The ones I scare of are the ones who think they are whole. She stood and gathered the bowls. There is one more thing you should know, Cole. Virgil Kane came into town yesterday. I saw him at the Lucky Strike. He did not ask anyone about you. He did not ask about the girl. He just sat there, drinking, listening, smiling. She paused at the door to her room. He is not looking for you. He is waiting. He knows you will come back to the courthouse because that is where the ledger is. The courthouse is the trap, and that man is the jaw. She closed her door. The fire popped, and somewhere in the dark between here and Copper Bend, a man with a scar along his jaw sat in a saloon chair with patience that could outlast stone, waiting for his prey to come to him. Because prey always does. That is the one thing a hunter can always count on. And in the courthouse that smelled of lemon oil and cold tea, Judge Solomon Hatch sat at a dead man's desk. Not his own desk. James Hadley's desk. The desk where the marshal had worked before Hatch put a bullet in his back and had the blood wiped off the floor like spilled coffee. He read the letter he had written to Martha, his wife. Dead 7 years. Buried in Vermont in a churchyard he would never visit again. Martha, I have done what was necessary. The territory required firmness. History will show I built something from nothing, and the cost. He stopped writing, crossed out the last 3 words. Wrote, and the cost was acceptable. Crossed that out, too. He stared at the page, poured tea from the pot on the side table, the same blend Martha used to drink. The cup was fine china, absurdly delicate for a frontier courthouse. He drank. The tea was cold. He drank it anyway. He tore the letter in half, then in quarters, dropped the pieces into the waste bin. He sat in the dark for a long time, holding the empty teacup, and did not write another. They hid in Agnes Clay's barn for 2 days. And in those 2 days, Elijah Cole learned that nothing tests a man's patience like sharing a small space with a woman who cannot stand to be helped. The trouble started before dawn on Thursday. Agnes brought a piece of paper she had torn from the fence post outside her gate. A wanted poster, fresh ink, nailed up by one of Hatch's riders who had come through the night before asking about a cowboy and a girl. Elijah's name was on it. $500. Sarah's name was on it, too. $1,000 alive, $1,200 dead. He read none of it because he could not read. Sarah read it to him, her voice flat and steady. The voice she used when the information was so bad that feeling anything about it would be a luxury she could not afford. "The dead bounty is higher," she said. "He does not want me back anymore. He wants me quiet." Elijah understood what that meant. The strategy had shifted. When Hatch sent Garrett and Polk, it had been to follow, to track, to find where Sarah had hidden the stolen ledger page. But the dead bounty being higher than the alive bounty meant Hatch had given up on the page. He wanted the witness silenced, permanently. This information sat over every quiet moment of the next 2 days like smoke in a closed room. It changed the color of everything. At midday on Thursday, a knock came at Agnes's cabin door. Elijah and Sarah flattened themselves behind hay bales in the barn and lay there breathing shallow for 40 minutes, while Agnes dealt with a miner who had come to pay his boarding fee. They could hear muffled voices through the wall. A laugh. A long pause that might have been a question. Another laugh. Every sound was a potential signal. Every silence was a potential threat. The miner left. Agnes came to the barn with a look on her face that said she was carrying something she did not want to set down. He asked about the 2 horses in the stable. I said my nephew is visiting. He believed me or he did not. Either way, he is gone. The threat did not resolve. It lingered. It sat in the corners of the barn like a living thing. They might have been seen, they might not. And they would not know until either nothing happened or everything did. That afternoon, Sarah sat against the barn wall cleaning a revolver that Elijah had given her from his saddlebag. She disassembled it with quick, efficient hands, checked the cylinder, wiped the barrel, loaded each chamber with the careful attention of someone who understood that a gun is not a weapon until it is clean, and a dirty gun is a promise waiting to be broken. Elijah watched her. Then he watched himself. He had taken out his own revolver to clean it, and his right hand was trembling the way it always trembled. Every small motion was compensated by his left. Opening the cylinder, left hand. Wiping the barrel, left hand steadying right. It was the dance he had performed 1,000 times, and he did it without thinking because thinking about it made it worse. Sarah was watching. "Your hand," she said. He did not look up. "What about it?" "It shakes." "Cold," he said. She said nothing. He could feel her silence. It was the silence of a woman who had just been lied to and was deciding how much it mattered. July in Arizona, 100 degrees in the shade, and the man sitting across from her had just said cold. Later in the day, Sarah knelt in the dirt floor of the barn and drew with a stick. A map. The courthouse. Rooms and hallways and staircases laid out from memory. Every corner precise. She wrote labels next to each room. Guard names, timing notes. The handwriting was clear and quick and practiced. Elijah crouched beside her to look at the map. He picked up the ledger page to compare it to something she was pointing at, and he held it upside down. He did not realize it immediately, but Sarah did. She looked at the page in his hands. She looked at his face, and he saw the understanding arrive in her eyes, quiet as a door opening. She did not laugh, did not pity. "My father could not read until he was 30, she said. "He taught himself." "Why?" "Because he wanted to be able to read my name." The silence that followed was different from all the silences that had come before. It was not cautious, not strategic, not the silence of 2 fugitives measuring each other. It was the silence of 2 people who had just shown each other something real and were sitting with the weight of it. He could not read. She could not trust. Both were learned deficiencies that felt permanent and were not. Both had been built by lives that had handed them exactly the wrong lessons at exactly the wrong time. Something began between them in that moment. Not romance. Nothing so simple or so named. Something quieter. A recognition that they were broken in ways that fit against each other like 2 halves of a door that had been kicked in from different sides. In the late afternoon, Sarah found a stray cat in the barn. A skinny thing, orange and ragged, that had been living under the hay bales. She sat on the floor and went still. perfectly still. The kind of still she had learned in her cell when every movement brought pain and the only power left was choosing not to move. The cat approached, sniffed, circled, and then settled in her lap. Sarah stroked it, clumsily, like someone who had forgotten how to touch a living thing without bracing for it to be taken away. Her fingers moved slow over the cat's spine, and the cat purred, and she sat there with tears she did not acknowledge on her face, and an animal in her lap that had chosen her for no reason, except that she was warm and still. Elijah saw this from across the barn. He did not speak, but something shifted in his chest, something that had nothing to do with plans or danger or the road ahead. He was looking at a woman who had been carrying a dead man's secret for 19 days, and in this one small moment had let something gentle past her walls. And it was the most human thing he had seen in years. Night came. Elijah could not sleep. He stepped outside and sat on the ground with his back against the barn wall and looked at the stars and felt his hand tremble in the dark. The whiskey bottle was in Ridley's saddlebag. He had carried it for 7 months. A reminder, he told himself. A test. Proof that he could carry it without opening it. But tonight, the proof felt thin, and the bottle felt heavy, and the distance between his hand and the saddlebag was shorter than it had ever been. Agnes found him. She did not ask what he was doing or why he was not sleeping. She just sat down beside him, the way you sit beside a fire, not too close, just near enough to share the warmth. "My Samuel drank," she said. "Every night after his shift. I hated the smell on his breath. But when he died, I wished I could smell it one more time." She was quiet for a moment. "You are not going to open that bottle tonight, are you?" "No, ma'am." "Good. Because I need you sober on Saturday, and I have already lost one man to that mine, and I am not losing another to a bottle." She stood and went inside and left him there in the dark with the stars and the trembling hand and the bottle he did not open. Not because he was strong, but because a woman with a dead husband and a shotgun had just told him she needed him sober, and being needed was a feeling he had almost forgotten. Sarah came to him later. She appeared from the barn door like a ghost, barefoot in Agnes's daughter's shoes, the borrowed dress pale in the moonlight. She sat beside him without asking permission, the way people sit when they have passed the point of permission and arrived at something else. "I have not told you everything," she said. "I figured. On the night Marshall Hadley died, I was in the courthouse. I was not just there. I saw it. I watched Hatch pull the gun. I watched Hadley fall. I am the only living witness to the murder of a United States Marshal." The words landed between them with the weight of a stone dropped into still water. Elijah felt the ripples spread through everything he thought he understood about the woman sitting beside him, about the poster nailed to Agnes's gate, about the dead bounty being higher than the alive one. "The bounty," he said. "Yes. Killing me does not just erase a thief, it erases the witness. I am the only person alive who saw that gun in his hand." Elijah was quiet for a long time, not because he was deciding whether to stay. That decision had been made on the courthouse porch in Copper Bend when he said the word "her" and meant it. He was quiet because he was realizing how alone she had been, how completely and utterly alone. Carrying a dead man's secret in a territory controlled by his killer, with no one to trust and no one to tell, and nothing between her and a shallow grave except a stolen page and the force of her own will. "Why did you not tell me from the start? Because if I told you, you would leave." "You do not know that. Everyone else did." He looked at her. She was staring straight ahead, her jaw set, her hands in her lap, the rope scars on her wrists visible in the moonlight. She looked like what she was. A 24-year-old woman who had been carrying more weight than any person should carry alone, and who had decided a long time ago that alone was the only way anything got carried. He did not reach for her, did not touch her, did not make promises he might not be able to keep. "I am still here," he said. It was not enough. He knew that. No single sentence could repair 19 days of chains and silence, and the absolute certainty that trust was a door that only opened one way, and the person who walked through it never came back. But it was what he had, and she heard it. And she stayed sitting beside him in the dark, which was its own kind of answer. She did not tell him everything. She did not tell him about the 3 steps, the door she could have pushed through, the shout she did not make, the frozen seconds when Hadley was 3 feet away and she could have saved him, and her body chose fear. That secret stayed locked. The last room in the house she had built inside her head. The room she would not open until the moment came when opening it was the only thing left to do. The plan had 7 steps. Elijah remembered 5. Sarah remembered all 7, but refused to repeat step 6, the one about what to do if everything went wrong, because she had already decided that step 6 did not exist. Agnes left for the Lucky Strike at dusk. She wore her best dress and carried a bottle of her strongest whiskey under her arm. She paused at the barn door and looked at them both, and the look she gave was the look of a woman who was not sure she would see them alive again. "Danny is at a friend's ranch 30 miles from here," she said. "I sent him yesterday." "You planned that," Sarah said. "I plan everything, girl. Learned it from watching Hatch." She almost smiled. Then the almost disappeared, and she was just Agnes Clay again. Hard, determined, carrying 3 years of fury in a body that had learned to hold it the way you hold a hot coal, tightly, carefully, knowing that letting go would burn everything. She left. The sound of her horse faded into the evening. They waited until full dark. Elijah saddled Ridley, who was better but not well. The cut in her hoof had closed, but she still stepped gingerly on it, and Elijah knew that if they needed to run, Ridley would give them everything she had, and it would not be enough. Sarah retrieved the gray mare from Cassidy's south pasture, a horse Agnes had arranged with a neighbor who owed her a favor and had sense enough not to ask why. They rode for Copper Bend in silence, side by side, the horse's hooves muffled by the thick summer dust. The town appeared as a scatter of yellow lights in the basin below. Music from the Lucky Strike, thin and tinny, a fiddle and a piano fighting each other for the melody. Elijah counted the lit windows, the saloon bright, the general store dark, the courthouse at the end of Main Street with one lamp burning in the front window. They tied the horses in a dry wash behind the feed store. From here they went on foot. Sarah's borrowed shoes made no sound on the packed earth. Elijah's boots were louder, and he cursed each step. The east side of the courthouse. Sarah found the drainage grate by feel, her fingers running along the foundation until they caught rusted iron. Elijah pulled. The grate resisted, then gave with a groan that sounded impossibly loud in the quiet street. They froze, listened. The fiddle kept playing. No shout, no footsteps. Sarah went first. She dropped into the crawl space and pulled herself forward on her elbows. Elijah followed, squeezing through the narrow opening, the underside of the courthouse floor inches from his back. Cobwebs dragged across his face. Something small and alive scuttled past his hand. The air smelled of dust and damp earth, and the faint ghost of lemon oil that had seeped through the floorboards above. They crawled in darkness until Sarah stopped. "Here," she whispered. "The trap door." He reached past her and felt the outline of a hatch in the floor above. He pushed. It lifted. Dim lamplight spilled down into the crawl space. They came up behind the judge's bench. The courtroom was empty. A single lamp burned on Hatch's desk near the front window. Shadows filled the rest of the room like dark water. The air smelled of lemon oil and old paper and something else, something cold. The smell of a room where bad things had happened and the walls had absorbed them. Sarah moved immediately toward the back staircase, the one Agnes had described. The one Hatch used to move between his chambers and the courtroom without being seen. She climbed each step like she was walking on glass. Elijah followed. His boots were too loud. He pulled them off and climbed in his socks. At the top, a narrow hallway. One door. Sarah knelt and pulled a thin metal pin from her hair, the kind used to hold a bun in place. She worked it into the lock. Her hands were shaking. Not the slow, steady tremor of Elijah's nerve damage, a different kind of shaking. The shaking of a body that remembered this building, remembered the cell, remembered the rope and the dark, and the 19 days of silence. Her mind wanted to pick the lock. Her body wanted to run. She fought the body. The body fought back. The pin slipped twice. 3 times. "Steady," Elijah whispered. "I am steady. The lock is not cooperating." A click. The door swung inward. Hatch's private chamber was small. A desk, a chair, a cabinet, a heavy iron safe in the corner. On the desk sat a cup of tea, half-finished and cold, and beside it a leather-bound book with no title on the spine. Brass clasps. Sarah opened it. Her hands stopped shaking. This is it. Every page, every name, every deed he forged, every tax he invented, every dollar he stole from people who could not fight back. She turned to a page near the back. Dated 3 weeks ago. The night Hadley died. In Hatch's own handwriting, precise and controlled. Disposed of the Marshall problem. Girl witnessed. To be dealt with. Elijah reached for the ledger. A floorboard groaned behind them. They spun. Elijah's hand went to his revolver. Sarah pressed the ledger to her chest. Elmer Briggs stood in the doorway. Not armed, not ready. He clutched a whiskey glass in one trembling hand and a ring of keys in the other. His face was gray. His eyes were wide. He looked like a man who had just opened a door expecting an empty room, and found instead the 2 people the entire territory was looking for. He opened his mouth. Sarah crossed the space between them in 2 steps and clamped her hand over it. "Do not scream," she said. Her voice was barely a breath. "Look at me, Briggs. Look at me." His eyes focused on her. The wild terror faded. He saw the ledger pressed against her chest. He saw what she had come for. And something in him broke open. He did not scream. He crumpled, slid down the doorframe and sat on the floor, whiskey sloshing over his trembling hand, and cried without sound. The kind of crying that comes from a place so deep inside a person that by the time it reaches the surface there is no noise left. Just shaking. Just the body letting go of something it was never built to carry. "I cleaned his blood off the floor," Briggs whispered. "Hadley's blood. I got on my hands and knees with a rag and I wiped it up and I wrung the rag into a bucket and I carried the bucket to the creek and I poured it in and watched it go downstream. And I have seen it every night since. Every night I close my eyes and I see that floor and I see the blood and I see his eyes staring at the door like he thought he could still make it." He looked at the ledger in Sarah's arms. "I made copies, 3 pages, the worst ones. They are hidden in my room. Take the book, please. End this. I cannot carry it anymore." Briggs was not brave. He was broken. Broken enough that the weight of silence had finally become heavier than the fear of speaking. There was no heroism in it, just a man who had reached the bottom of what he could hold and found that the bottom was not solid. "There is something else," Briggs said. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. "The judge is not here tonight. He rode out after supper to the South Relay Station. I heard him mention a name." "Finch." Sarah's face hardened. Hatch was meeting the federal marshal, the one ally with power, the one variable she could not control. The question of whose side Finch was really on suddenly had weight that pressed down on everything. "We need to go," Elijah said. He took the ledger from Sarah and tucked it under his arm. "Briggs, stay here. Stay quiet. If anyone asks, you were drinking in the judge's office because you always drink in the judge's office. Can you do that?" Briggs nodded. His hand was still shaking around the whiskey glass. He looked at Sarah one last time. "I am sorry," he said, "for what I did not do, for what I was too scared to do." Sarah looked at him, and the fury she expected to feel was not there. Instead, there was something worse, recognition. She knew what it was like to stand close enough to save a man and not move. She knew exactly what Briggs carried because she carried it too. "I know," she said. And the 2 words held everything she could not say. They turned to leave. Elijah was 2 steps down the hallway when he heard it. Footsteps on the staircase. Slow. Deliberate. The creak of each step measured and unhurried. The sound of a man who knew exactly how this ended and saw no reason to rush. Elijah's hand went to his revolver. His right hand. The one that shook. Virgil Kane reached the top of the stairs. He stood in the dim light with his arms at his sides, no weapon drawn, a scar along his jaw that looked like a second mouth grinning. He was not tall, but he took up space the way a storm takes up space. You felt it before you understood what it was. I waited at the courthouse because I knew she would come back, Kane said. His voice was flat, unhurried. Prey always returns to where it hid the food. Elijah stepped between Kane and Sarah. The hallway was narrow, close quarters, the worst possible place for a gunfight, because at this range nobody misses and everybody bleeds. Sarah, Elijah said without turning, the window at the end of the hall. Go. I am not leaving you. Take the ledger. Get to the horses. Ride east. She did not move. Trust me, he said. This time, trust me. A beat. The longest second of his life. He could feel her behind him, feel the war between her instinct to control and the terrifying leap of letting someone else carry the weight. She moved. He heard her footsteps retreating down the hall, heard the window open, heard the thud of her landing on the porch roof below. Kane watched her go. His eyes tracked the sound the way a cat tracks a bird. Then they came back to Elijah. Shaking hand, Kane said, he had noticed. Of course he had noticed. A man like Kane noticed everything. That is what made him what he was. Elijah drew. Kane drew faster. The hallway exploded with sound and light. Kane's bullet tore through the plaster 6 inches from Elijah's head. Elijah fired back. His hand shook. The bullet went wide, punched into the wall behind Kane. He fired again. This time the bullet found something, Kane's shoulder. The impact spun him half around and blood sprayed the wall. But Kane did not fall. He stepped backward into the shadow of the staircase and his voice came out of the dark. Shaking hand. Interesting. Elijah did not pursue. Kane wanted him to follow. Into the dark. Onto Kane's ground. That was how men like Kane worked. They pulled you into the place where they had the advantage, and then they killed you there. He turned and ran for the window. Dove through it, hit the porch roof, rolled, dropped into the dirt. Sarah was gone. The dry wash where the horses should have been was empty. Both ropes cut. Someone had moved them. Briggs appeared from the courthouse shadows. The clerk had hidden during the gunfight, too scared to run but too involved to leave. The girl went east, Briggs said, toward the Garrett ranch. She was running hard. Elijah ran. Sarah hit the ground running and did not stop. Behind her the courthouse was a block of shadow against the night sky. She heard 2 gunshots, then a third. She did not know which was Elijah's and which was meant for him. She did not stop to find out because the ledger was in her arms, and the ledger was more important than any one person, including her, and including him. She ran for the dry wash. The horses were gone, both ropes cut clean. Someone had found them, someone who knew to look. She stood in the wash for 3 seconds, the longest 3 seconds of her life, and made a decision. Not the saloon where Agnes was, not the boarding house, not any of the places where people who had helped her might be found. She ran toward the Garrett ranch, 2 miles east. Tom Garrett had given them 4 hours, and the 4 hours were not up, and Garrett had horses, and Garrett was the one person she had already persuaded through logic. She did not consider Agnes because Agnes was an emotional variable. Someone who had given her shoes and called her stupid. Someone whose help came from feeling rather than reasoning. Sarah trusted logic. Trusted. Logic, said Garrett. She ran 2 miles in the dark. Agnes's shoes held. The leather gripped the earth and the laces stayed tight, and the dead girl's shoes carried the living woman through the night, the way a gift carries intention beyond the hand that gives it. She reached the ranch, pounded on the door. Annie Garrett opened it. 7 months pregnant, frightened eyes, a lamp in one hand and the other hand on her belly. "Tom is not here," Annie said. "He rode out this afternoon." "I need a horse," Sarah said. "Please, right now." Annie looked at her, at the ledger, at the rope burns on her wrists and the sweat on her face and the desperate animal fear in her eyes. Annie Garrett was not a woman who asked questions when the answers were written on someone's face. "Take the bay in the barn," Annie said. "He is saddled. Tom keeps him ready." Sarah took the horse, rode east, did not look back. She told herself she would send help, told herself Annie would be fine, told herself the calculus was correct, that one pregnant woman in a dark house was not in danger because the people chasing Sarah did not know she had come here. She was wrong. 15 minutes after Sarah rode east, Curtis and a man named Webb arrived at the Garrett Ranch. They had tracked Sarah's footprints from the courthouse, found the trail in the dust, followed it to the ranch. They found the barn door open, a horse missing. They knocked on the door. Annie opened it. "Where is the girl?" Curtis asked. "What girl?" "The girl who took your horse." "We can see the tracks, Mrs. Garrett, fresh, leading right up to your door. I do not know what you are talking about." Curtis was a thick man with a sunburned neck and the patience of a man who had been taking orders from a judge for too long to worry about the morality of any particular order. He pushed past Annie into the cabin. Webb followed. They searched, found nothing. Came back to Annie. "Where did she go? I told you. I do not know any girl." Curtis grabbed her arm, not hard enough to break bone, hard enough to bruise. Annie jerked back. Her hand went to her belly. "I am carrying a child," she said. Her voice shook but did not break. "Then tell me what I want to know, and I will leave you and the child alone." She did not tell them. She stood in her own doorway with a hand on her belly and a bruise forming on her arm, and she did not say one word about the woman who had taken her husband's horse and ridden east into the dark. Curtis shoved her against the wall. Her shoulder hit the door frame. She cried out. Webb shifted his weight, uncomfortable, looking away. They left. Annie sank to the floor. She sat there with her arms around her belly and her back against the wall and cried without sound. Her lip was bleeding. Her shoulder throbbed. But the baby inside her was still. And then it kicked, and the kick was the only thing that kept her from falling into the kind of despair that does not have a bottom. Elijah found her. He had run from the courthouse to the wash to the road to the ranch, 2 miles on foot in the dark. And when he reached the Garrett place and saw the door open and the lamp knocked over and Annie on the floor, he felt something turn to ice inside his chest. He knelt beside her. His hands were shaking, both of them. "Are you hurt?" "They pushed me," Annie said. "They asked about a girl. I did not tell them anything." "Is the baby all right?" "The baby is kicking. I think the baby is angry." Elijah almost laughed. He did not. Instead, he helped Annie stand, checked her arm, checked her shoulder, nothing broken. The bruise would heal. The memory would not. He took Annie to Agnes, rode Ridley through the dark to the boarding house where Agnes had returned after closing down the saloon. Agnes took one look at Annie, and her face became something terrible. The face of a woman who had spent 3 years containing rage and was watching the container crack. "Who did this?" Agnes asked. "Curtis. And another man. They were looking for Sarah." Agnes's hand went to her shotgun. Elijah put his hand on the barrel. "Not tonight. We need you. Annie needs you. If you ride into Copper Bend with that gun, you will not ride back." Agnes looked at him. Her eyes were wet and burning. Then she looked at Annie, who was sitting in a chair with both hands on her belly, and the fire in Agnes's eyes banked itself. Not extinguished. Banked. The kind of fire that waits. She sat down beside Annie and took the young woman's hand and held it, and did not let go. Elijah rode east. He had to find Sarah. She was alone in the desert with the ledger and a stolen horse and no idea which roads were safe. And he had to tell her what her decision had cost. What running to Garrett instead of trusting Agnes had meant for a pregnant woman who had done nothing wrong except open her door. He found her 3 miles out. She was stopped in the shadow of a rock outcropping. The bay horse was blowing hard, and Sarah was sitting on the ground with the ledger in her lap, and Elijah's spare revolver in her hand pointed at his chest. "It is me," he said. She did not lower the gun. Her face was a mask of exhaustion and fear, and something else. Something that looked like it might be the beginning of the end of the person she had been trying to be. "How do I know Cain did not send you?" "Because Cain does not send people. He comes himself." The gun wavered, then dropped. Sarah's whole body sagged. "I thought you were dead," she said. "Not yet." He dismounted, crouched beside her, and told her about Annie. The stillness that came over Sarah was the worst kind, the kind she had learned in her cell, the kind that meant she was locking everything down because if she let even one feeling through the wall, the rest would follow and drown her. "Is Annie all right?" "Annie is all right. The baby is all right. But I need you to hear something, Sarah. You ran to Garrett because you did not trust Agnes. You did not trust anyone you had not already convinced with logic. And that choice put a pregnant woman on the floor of her own home with a bruise on her arm and blood on her lip. She did not argue, did not defend, did not explain. She sat there in the dark with the ledger in her lap, and the weight of what she had done settling onto her shoulders like a yoke. And for the first time since he had known her, Sarah Dunn looked at herself and did not like what she saw. "This is my fault," she said. "It is not that simple. It is exactly that simple. I calculated. I chose. And someone who had nothing to do with any of this got hurt because I could not trust a woman who gave me shoes." Elijah had no answer for that, because she was right, and the truth of it sat between them like a third person, silent and immovable. They were sitting in the dark beside the road when the horse came from the west, a single rider, moving at a steady trot, not fast, not slow, the pace of a man who knows where he is going and is in no particular hurry to get there. Elijah drew his revolver. Sarah raised hers. The rider materialized through the dark, Federal badge catching starlight. Oscar Finch pulled his horse to a stop 10 feet away and looked at them with the tired eyes of a man who had been playing a game with too many pieces for too long. "Cole. Miss Dunn. I have been looking for you." "And we have been running," Sarah said. Her gun did not lower. "How did you find us?" "I know these roads better than anyone in this territory. I have been riding them for 4 months, and I have been tracking you since Copper Bend." The third dust trail. The one Sarah had seen behind them on the first day. The rider moving at a different pace. Not chasing, observing. It was Finch. It had been Finch the entire time. "You were the third rider," Sarah said. "Yes. Why?" "Because you had the ledger page and Hatch had men following you, and I needed both of you alive long enough to get to the actual ledger. You were my case, Miss Dunn. Both of you." Sarah's jaw tightened. "Your case?" Finch dismounted. He stood in the moonlight with his hands visible, making no move toward his weapon. He was not a physically imposing man. Lean, weathered, the kind of face that gave nothing away for free. But his eyes were sharp and they missed nothing, and in this moment they were looking at Sarah with something she did not expect. Respect. "I need to tell you something," Finch said, "and you are not going to like it. Try me. I have known about you since my first week in Copper Bend. I knew you were chained in that cell. I knew the charges were fabricated. I knew Hatch was holding you illegally." Silence. "And you did nothing," Sarah said. "I did not have enough evidence to move against Hatch without him destroying everything. If I rescued you early, he would have burned the ledger, scattered his witnesses, and I would have lost the only chance to bring him down. I needed the ledger. I needed you alive to testify, and I needed Hatch to believe he was still in control long enough to make a mistake." "You left me in chains for 3 weeks," Sarah said, and her voice was the flattest and most dangerous sound Elijah had ever heard. "You knew I was there. You knew what they were doing to me, and you left me." Finch did not flinch, did not look away. "I left you in chains for 3 weeks because of 14 families robbed of their land, 3 men dead in the mines, and a United States Marshal shot in a courthouse. Yes, I chose." The words hung in the air. Elijah watched Sarah process them, watched the fury build behind her eyes, watched her reach for the thing she always reached for, the righteous anger of a woman wronged, the clarity that comes from knowing exactly who the enemy is. And then watched something else happen, something he had not seen before. She recognized Finch's logic, not agreed with it, recognized it, because it was the same logic she had used, the same cold calculation. Give people just enough truth to make them useful, withhold the rest, use them as instruments toward a larger goal. She had done it to Elijah. Finch had done it to her. He was a mirror, the ugliest kind, the kind that shows you exactly who you are when you strip away the justification. She lowered the gun. Elijah stepped in. He had watched this moment build, and he understood that someone needed to be the bridge between these two people who were too alike to trust each other and too smart not to need each other. The ledger goes through federal channels, Elijah said. Proper custody, documented, sealed. So no lawyer can argue it was tampered with. Finch nodded. But Sarah keeps the 3 copied pages from Briggs as insurance. If the ledger disappears, if you bury it, if Hatch's lawyers make it go away, those pages go to Edward Walsh at the Tucson Star and the story runs on the front page. And then you have a case built on stolen evidence and a newspaper article, Finch said, instead of a federal prosecution with chain of custody. And you have a career-making conviction, Elijah said, instead of a mess that nobody controls. Finch looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at Finch. The calculation ran behind both sets of eyes. Neither trusted the other, but both understood leverage. And leverage, unlike trust, does not require faith. Agreed, Finch said. He pulled a telegraph form from his vest pocket and wrote the receipt on the back of it, signed it. Sarah took the ledger from under her arm and held it for a long moment, both hands on the leather, feeling the weight of it. Not the physical weight, the weight of 19 days and a dead man on a courthouse floor and a father buried in rocky ground, and a territory full of people who had been robbed and beaten and silenced by the man whose handwriting filled these pages. She handed it to Finch. He took it carefully, the way a man handles something he knows people have died for. There is one more thing, Finch said. Kane is alive. You hit his shoulder in the courthouse, but he walked out, and Hatch knows the ledger is gone. I was with him tonight. Kept him at the relay station while you were inside. He does not know I was playing him, but he will figure it out. A cornered animal is the most dangerous kind, and Solomon Hatch has been the most dangerous man in this territory for 15 years. He did not get there by giving up. Finch mounted. He looked at them both. My deputy Warren will meet you on the Tucson Road at dawn. He will escort you and the ledger to the federal court. I am going back to Copper Bend to execute an arrest warrant. If all goes well, Hatch will be in custody by tomorrow night. And if all does not go well, then ride fast. He turned his horse west, toward the smoke, toward the town, toward the man who thought he was untouchable. Sarah watched him go. He left me in chains, she said. Yes. And I left Annie on a floor. Yes. She was quiet for a long time. I hate that he is right, she said. About the calculus. About what it cost to bring down a man like Hatch. I hate that it costs what it costs and that the people who pay are never the ones who should. Elijah had no answer, so he gave her the only thing he had, his presence. Standing beside her in the dark, not a solution, not a comfort, just another person breathing in the same night air, carrying some of the weight. They should ride, he said. She nodded, mounted the bay. He mounted Ridley. They rode east toward Tucson. And behind them the night settled over the territory like a held breath, waiting for morning, waiting for the reckoning that was coming, whether anyone was ready for it or not. They were half a day from Tucson, when Elijah saw the black horse on the horizon, standing still, riderless, facing them like a period at the end of a death sentence. He held up his hand and the small column stopped. Deputy Warren rode alongside, the sealed leather satchel with the ledger strapped across his chest. Sarah pulled the bay up beside Elijah. "That is Cain's horse," she said. Elijah scanned the landscape. Open ground, sparse mesquite, long sight lines in every direction, nowhere to hide, except the rocks. 100 yards ahead, a tumble of boulders broke the flat ground. Sandstone. Weathered. Tall enough to hide a man. He abandoned his horse, Elijah said. A horse is visible from a mile away. A man on foot in those rocks is not. The ambush came 1 minute later. The rifle crack split the silence like an axe through wood. Warren jerked in his saddle. His horse screamed. The deputy fell sideways and hit the ground hard, and the satchel came loose and landed in the dust beside him. Elijah grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her off the bay, and behind a boulder in the same motion. Bullets sang off the rock above their heads. The sound was sharp and close, and it brought everything back. Shiloh, the farmhouse, the muzzle flash, the face of a child. Warren was down, 20 yards in the open, not moving, blood spreading under his leg, shot through the thigh. Femoral territory, bleeding fast. Cain was in the rocks above. Elevation, cover, clear sight lines, patience. He had every advantage, and he only needed one. He could sit up there and wait until they ran out of options or blood. This was not a gunfight from a dime novel. This was an attrition siege. The kind of fight where the man on top holds all the cards and the man on the bottom has to do something desperate or die slowly. Sarah crawled toward Warren. Elijah grabbed her arm. "He will shoot you before you get halfway. He will shoot Warren if we do not stop the bleeding." She pulled free and crawled, flat on her belly, dust in her face, rock cutting her elbows. She reached Warren and pulled him behind a second boulder and pressed both hands on the wound. The blood came through her fingers, warm and fast. The satchel was still in the open, 10 feet away. The ledger inside it. Everything they had fought for lying in the dust between two boulders. Sarah looked at Elijah across the gap. He saw the question in her eyes, the satchel or Warren's life. She could not hold pressure on the wound and reach the satchel at the same time. "Hold the pressure," Elijah said. "I will get the satchel." He moved. Cain's bullet hit the rock beside his head and sprayed stone fragments into his cheek. He ducked back. Blood ran down his face, not deep, but close. Inches from dead. He needed to shoot Cain, from 50 yards. With a shaking hand, he pulled the revolver, rested his forearm on the boulder, aimed. His hand trembled. The front sight danced across the rocks where Cain was hidden. He could not hold it still, could not find the stillness that shooting requires. The tremor was there, always there. The bayonet wound and the whiskey years and the guilt of a child who might have died because of him. Cain fired again. The bullet hit the ground in front of Warren and threw dust into Sarah's face. She did not flinch. She held the pressure, blood between her fingers, her jaw locked. Elijah looked at his hand, the hand that shook, the hand Garrett had humiliated him with, the hand he had not trusted in years. "Elijah." Sarah's voice, across the gap, looking at him. She had seen the hand. She had seen the tremor. She had seen him frozen behind the boulder with his gun raised and his arm shaking, and she understood in that moment what he had been carrying. Her eyes met his, and she said the 3 words he had not known he needed to hear until he heard them. "I trust you. Not logic, not calculation. Not the careful, measured language of a woman who gave people only what she needed them to have. Just trust, given freely, in the worst possible moment, because it was the only moment it mattered." He breathed, tucked his left elbow against his ribs, wrapped his left hand over his right the way he had been taught in the army. A field technique. Press down on the tremor, not eliminate it. You cannot eliminate a tremor, but you can lean into it, fight it, reduce it to something you can work with. He aimed. The front sight still moved, but less. Not still. Nothing would ever be still, but less. He fired. The bullet hit the rock 3 inches from Cain's head. Stone fragments sprayed into the tracker's face. Cain flinched, rolled sideways, exposed. Elijah fired again. The bullet found Cain's center mass. Not a clean shot, not a marksman's bullet. A shaking hand and a prayer, and just barely enough. Cain fell, slid down the rock face, landed on his back in the dust. His rifle clattered away from him. Elijah moved, crossed the open ground to the satchel, grabbed it, crossed to Cain. The killer was still alive. Barely. He lay on his back, looking at the sky. Blood spread beneath him. The scar along his jaw twitched as he tried to smile. Shaking hand, Cain said, "Still hit." "Huh." He sounded almost impressed. Then the light went out of his eyes and Virgil Cain was gone. Elijah stood over the body for a moment. His hand was shaking worse than ever. The adrenaline was making it worse. Everything was making it worse. But the bullet had gone where he pointed it. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but enough. Enough was a word he was learning to live with. He ran back to Warren. Sarah had kept pressure on the wound. The bleeding had slowed, but not stopped. Warren's face was gray. Elijah tore strips from his shirt, made a tourniquet, tied it above the wound. Field medicine. Rough. Desperate. The kind you do when there is no doctor and no time, and the only thing between a man and death is how fast you can tie a knot. Warren would live, but the leg would not. The bullet had torn through muscle and hit bone. Even if they reached a surgeon in Tucson, the damage was done. The victory had cost a man his leg. Clean endings were for other stories. They loaded Warren onto his horse. Sarah rode beside him, holding him in the saddle. Elijah led the column on Ridley. An hour later, as the outskirts of Tucson began to rise from the desert floor, a rider appeared from the west, riding hard. A woman on a lathered horse, face streaked with tears and dust, belly heavy with child. Annie Garrett. She reached them and pulled up, and the words came out of her like stones falling. "Tom is dead. They burned the ranch last night, Hatch's men, because Tom let you pass in the canyon." Sarah stopped breathing. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind and the horses and the creak of leather. She looked at Annie, at the tears, at the belly, at the face of a woman who had buried her husband and ridden through the night to be here. "This is my fault." Elijah spoke. Tom Garrett stood up in that canyon. He stood up at his ranch. Every time it was his choice. That does not make it hurt less. No. But it means you do not carry it alone. Sarah sat on her horse with the ledger in the satchel and the knowledge of Tom Garrett's death settling into her bones. And the weight of it was different from every other weight she had carried, because this one had a face, a name, a wife, a child who would never know its father. At the edge of Tucson, she stopped, turned to Elijah. "Before we go in there, before I swear an oath and tell a room full of strangers what I saw, I need to tell you something I have never told anyone." She told him. The 3 steps. The door she could have pushed through, the shout she did not make, Hadley falling while she stood close enough to touch him. I could have saved him. I was right there. And I did not move. My body just... I could not. She could not finish the sentence. 19 days of iron composure, and this was what lived underneath it. The woman who planned a war from a jail cell had built every plan as a barricade against the same truth. When it mattered most, she froze. Elijah was quiet. Not because he was choosing words, because some things deserve silence before they deserve speech. "At Shiloh," he said. "My unit fired into a farmhouse at dusk. I pulled the trigger. There was a child inside. I do not know if my bullet was the one, but I decided it was because somebody had to carry it." He looked at her. "You froze. I fired. Neither of us saved anybody. The difference is you have been punishing yourself for 19 days, and I have been punishing myself for 6 years. And neither of us has changed what happened by carrying the weight. So what do? We walk into that courtroom, and we tell the truth. Not because it fixes the past, because it is the only thing that has ever moved the world forward even an inch." She held his gaze. And the wall behind her eyes, the one she had built across 19 days of silence and chain and solitary rage, did not come down all at once. It came down in pieces, slowly, like ice breaking on a river when the season finally turns. "Thank you," she said, "for not leaving. You have never said thank you to anyone before, have you? Never had anyone stay long enough to earn it." The courtroom in Tucson was smaller than the one in Copper Bend. Sarah Dunn thought that was a strange thing, that the room where truth was spoken should be smaller than the room where truth was killed. It filled early. Ranchers from 3 counties, miners still wearing dust, women with children on their laps, journalists from Tucson and Phoenix with notebooks and sharp pencils. Edward Walsh of the Tucson Star sat in the second row, notebook open, pencil ready. The man she had tried to reach with a letter that never arrived, but whose story had found him anyway. Agnes Clay sat in the back row, Danny beside her. The boy was 17, wiry, confused, gripping his mother's hand. Agnes looked at Sarah when she entered and gave the smallest nod, a weight only 2 women could measure. Annie Garrett was there, back row, hands on her belly, face carrying the particular endurance of a woman who had buried her husband 3 days ago and ridden 40 miles to be in this room. Not for justice, not for revenge, to make sure her husband's name was spoken out loud in a place where it mattered. Hatch was brought through a side door, clean-shaven, suit pressed, hands cuffed but held low, almost casually, as if the cuffs were a clerical error that would be corrected shortly. He sat at the defense table and surveyed the room with the expression Elijah remembered from the courthouse porch in Copper Bend, the expression of a man who believed he owned the room. Then his eyes found Sarah. She sat in the front row, blue dress, the one provided by the court, clean against her dark hair. The bruise on her cheekbone had faded to yellow. The rope scars on her wrists were visible below her sleeves, and her eyes were locked on his, carrying every hour of every day she had spent in his cell. Hatch's composure cracked. A fraction, tightening around his mouth, a flicker in his eyes. Then he looked away. Sarah did not. Judge Callahan entered. The room stood. The proceedings began. The prosecutor laid out the charges in language that was plain and brutal. Murder of United States Marshal James Hadley. Fraud. Theft of territorial lands. Conspiracy. Obstruction of justice. False imprisonment. The words filled the small courtroom like water rising. Hatch's attorney objected to everything. The ledger was stolen property. The witnesses were compromised. The chain of custody was questionable. Callahan overruled him each time, his voice level, his patience endless. When asked if he wished to make a statement, Hatch looked at Sarah, and he spoke, not angry, not threatening, but with the exhausted conviction of a man who still believed his own story. "I built that town from sand and nothing. Every road, every well, every building. Before me there was dust and violence and men killing each other over water holes. I made something. You can call it theft, but before me there was nothing to steal." Callahan looked at him for a long moment. "There was one thing before you, Judge Hatch. People. And you treated them like raw material." The court called Sarah Dunn. Sarah stood. Her hands shook at her sides. She clenched them into fists, released them, walked to the witness stand, was sworn in, raised her right hand. The rope scar was visible to every person in the room. The scar testified before she opened her mouth. She told the story, slowly, voice steady at first and then cracking in the places where a real voice cracks. Not performed, not rehearsed, honest. She described the night, the hallway, the door, the gunshot, the body falling, the sound blood makes on a wooden floor. Hatch standing over the body with the gun in his hand, putting it back in his desk drawer like he was putting away a pen. Halfway through, she lost a detail. Went blank. The courtroom waited. Hatch's attorney leaned forward. The silence stretched. Sarah's hands gripped the arms of the chair, rope scars white against her knuckles. She looked past the attorney, past Hatch, found Elijah in the third row. He did not nod, did not mouth words, just sat there, present, That was all. Then she looked one row behind him. Annie Garrett, hands on her belly, eyes on Sarah, waiting for the words that would decide whether her husband died for something or for nothing. Sarah remembered. She continued. She finished. He told me I could keep quiet or hang for a murder I did not commit. He said he had 3 witnesses who would swear I pulled the trigger. He sold me on a courthouse porch like livestock because he thought that was cleaner than killing me. She looked at Hatch one final time. You said the territory does not need justice. It needs order. Your order. But your order killed James Hadley. Your order killed my father in a mine shaft that collapsed because you cut $12 from the timber budget. Your order killed Tom Garrett when your men burned his ranch because he dared to let me pass. This is not order. This is a man who confused power with truth, and I am done being quiet about it. Briggs testified next. Confirmed everything. Shaking hands, gray face, a glass of water rattling against his teeth every time he drank. I hear that gunshot every night, Briggs said, and I see Hadley on the floor. His eyes were on the door, like he thought he could still make it. Annie Garrett stood in the gallery, not called, not scheduled. She stood and the room went quiet. My husband's name was Thomas Andrew Garrett. He was 30 years old. He was going to be a father. Judge Hatch stole our water and our land, and then he stole everything else. I want that in the record. Callahan did not use his gavel. He picked up his pen and wrote it down himself. This court finds sufficient evidence to bind Judge Solomon Hatch over for trial on all charges before the Territorial Court of Arizona. The defendant will be held without bail at the Yuma Territorial Prison pending trial. He paused. For the record, this court recognizes the extraordinary courage of Miss Sarah Dunn, whose testimony and actions have brought evidence to light that might otherwise have been buried in a courthouse fire and a shallow grave. The gavel fell. Once. Sharp and final. Hatch was led out. At the door he turned. His eyes found Sarah across the room. He opened his mouth. Whatever he was going to say died on his tongue. The door closed behind him. Outside on the courthouse steps, the sun was warm and the street was full of ordinary sounds. Wagons, voices, hammering from new construction. The world going on the way it does when the storm has passed and people start remembering what normal feels like. Walsh found Sarah first. Miss Dunn, I believe you tried to write me a letter. I did. I would like to hear the story now. On one condition. You print Agnes Clay's name as a hero, not a footnote. Walsh tipped his hat. Yes, ma'am. Agnes came next, Danny in tow. The 2 women looked at each other, no embrace. Oh, no tears in public. The shoes fit? Agnes asked. They fit, that was all. Agnes walked away without looking back, because looking back meant crying, and Agnes Clay did not cry in public. 3 months later, the Tucson Star published Walsh's account under a headline that ran the full width of the front page. Hatch was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life at the Yuma Territorial Prison. 14 families recovered stolen land. The territorial governor appointed a new judge for Copper Bend. Agnes Clay stood on the porch of her boarding house as a wagon pulled up carrying new guests. She was smiling, the first time anyone had seen her smile in 3 years. Danny worked at the blacksmith's forge with a hammer in his hand and sweat on his face that was cleaner than mine sweat. Annie Garrett sat on the porch of a small new house with a baby girl in her arms, and Tom's old hat hanging on the fence post, brim collecting dust. Briggs sat in a bar somewhere east with a glass in front of him, still full. He had not drunk it, had not poured it out either, not ready to quit, but trying. And on the courthouse porch in Copper Bend, the wicker chair where Judge Solomon Hatch had once sat with his tea and his cruelty and his unshakable belief that power was the same thing as truth, stood empty, dusty, forgotten by everyone who walked past it. Evening. A small house on the eastern edge of Tucson. Sarah sat at a kitchen table with a book open in front of her. Her finger moved under each word, slow and patient, the same way her father had taught her at a kitchen table a lifetime ago by candlelight in a miner's cabin, where the walls were thin and the future was uncertain, and the only sure thing was that a woman who could read was a woman nobody could own. Elijah sat across from her, sounding out letters, getting them wrong, trying again. C-O-L-E. That is your name, not the lesson. It is the first word I want to read. She shook her head, but she was smiling. The real one, the one that had taken weeks to find and months to trust and a lifetime of hurt to earn. The whiskey bottle sat on a shelf by the door, dusty, unopened. 7 months had become 10. Sarah stood, walked to the porch. Elijah followed. The desert sky was enormous, purple at the edges where the sun had just gone down. Wind coming off the flats carrying the first cool air they had felt in months, and something else underneath it. The smell of rain. I want to write a letter to Annie tomorrow, Sarah said. You write it. I will spell Garrett's name. She looked at him, and then she reached over and placed her hand on his, the right hand, the one that shook. She did not grip, did not squeeze, just rested her fingers across his knuckles. The rope scars on her wrist had faded to pink. Healing, not healed, but healing. And his hand went still, not because she cured him. Not because love is medicine for nerve damage and old guilt, but because in this moment he did not need to hold a gun, did not need to grip reins, did not need to prove his hand was steady enough to be worth something. He just needed to be here. 2 hands on a porch railing, one scarred from rope, one that had stopped shaking for now, for this moment. And that was enough. Wind off the desert, the smell of rain coming. And the candle burned steady between 2 people who were not whole, not healed, not finished, but who had chosen each other again and again, at every moment when walking away would have been easier. The loudest voice in the room is never the strongest. The strongest is the one that refuses to be silenced. And Sarah Dunn, the girl in rope, the cleaning woman who could read, the witness who carried a dead man's truth through chains and fire in a territory that wanted her buried, had spoken, and the whole world heard. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.